Welcome to the Virtual Cardiology Congress sponsored by the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine on CardioCare Live. My name is Dr. Chris Cannon, and you're tuned in to a live session called Understanding and Controlling Obesity. This is with colleague Dr. Lee Kaplan of the Massachusetts General Hospital. He is the director of the Obesity, Metabolism, and Nutrition Institute and the founding director of the Weight Center at the Massachusetts General Hospital. He's an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Now, before we get started, I'd like to remind our audience that we'll be taking questions, and I'll get them here on the laptop in real time throughout the presentation. And so you can send the questions through anytime during the program through the box that's in the lower left-hand side of your screen. And then I'll look at those and try and intersperse them with Dr. Kaplan's presentation. So I'm really looking forward to this. I hope you'll enjoy it as well. I'm here to learn about a huge topic, no pun intended, that is facing all of us, and I think there's a lot of great hope. So Dr. Kaplan, we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Chris, and very much appreciate the opportunity to talk this morning. I'm going to talk about obesity, which unfortunately, a little bit like the weather, we talk about it a lot and haven't been able to do too much about it as of yet. But I think that it's important to take a physiological approach to the problem, and that's what I'm going to try to do over the next few minutes. We all know, and almost everybody who talks about this area shows a slide like this, where food intake has to equal energy expenditure, or you're going to gain weight or lose weight. And indeed, that's true. We live by the laws of physics, and of course, if there are more calories coming in than going out, then we are going to gain weight. However, the assumption underlying this slide is somewhat faulty, in that we forget that human life, any life actually, works against equilibrium, works against trying to pursue the laws of physics alone. Indeed, all of us extract energy out of the environment for the purpose of growth and reproduction and all of the activities of normal life. And in doing so, we stay away from the equilibrium state. Indeed, the equilibrium state is death, as defined here. And so on top of the laws of physics, for every kind of physiological function, we add physiology. And I like to do this in a way using the cartoon character to basically show that the central nervous system holds food intake and energy expenditure in very close relationship, even in the setting of this massive obesity epidemic that we're undergoing at the present time. And I'm going to come back to this, but it's important to note that our ability to regulate food intake and energy expenditure in order to maintain the balance here is extraordinarily powerful and only has to go awry by a tiny bit in order to cause the phenotype of obesity that, of course, itself is not subtle. Now, one of the most interesting hypotheses has been that the reason we have an obesity epidemic is that we don't exercise as much as we used to, and that in the old days we evolved to be hunter-gatherers, and that when you're a hunter-gatherer, what ends up happening is that you are expending an enormous amount of energy. Well, it turns out that there is a tribe of hunter-gatherers, the Hadza tribe, that a group of investigators became friendly with, and the tribe allowed them to use a technique called doubly labeled water to determine energy expenditure. That determines energy expenditure not on a minute-by-minute basis, but integrated over a period of several days or a week or so. And so this group of hunter-gatherers that are true hunter-gatherers, the women pick berries while they're holding their babies, and the men are chasing after game, et cetera, et cetera. This group of hunter-gatherers were proposed or hypothesized to burn more energy, and that's the reason why they're so thin. Well, it turns out, as you can see on this slide here, that the hunter-gatherers are shown in red. There are two red dots there. The solid dots are the males, the open dots are the females. And you can see that they're actually on the lower end of total daily energy expenditure. Now, energy expenditure each day correlates with body mass, but they're well within the normal range. And what this shows is that despite the fact that they're burning perhaps 1,000 more calories a day by running around than we as Westerners do, in comparison to all the gray dots and the blue dots on this slide, which are, each dot represents the results of a single study. So if there are this many dots, that means that there are this many studies that have been published. That instead of hunter-gatherers exerting more energy expenditure per day, they exert the exact same amount as would be predicted by their size. So there's a compensation. They burn more by running around, and their body compensates by decreasing resting energy expenditure so that total energy expenditure is no greater, perhaps less, than in Westerners. And the authors of this paper that was published earlier this year in PLOS One hypothesized, actually concluded, that human daily energy expenditure is an evolved physiological trait. It is not merely the summation of the calories burned at rest plus the calories burned by running around. So when we think about the normal physiology of energy balance, we know that each of us requires about 800 calories a day. But we eat far more than 800 calories a day. Typically, an adult consumes between 2,000 and 2,500 calories a day, which represents almost 3 times as much as we really need. So every day we're burning off those excess calories. And so every day we know not only to burn them off, but how much to burn off so that we maintain a balance that's quite close to normal. In fact, maintaining weight within a 20-pound range between the ages of 21 and 65 requires matching of intake and expenditure within 0.2%, which corresponds to an accuracy of 4 to 5 calories a day, or less than half a potato chip. And so therefore, by maintaining normal fat stores, we precisely dispose of that 60 to 70% of our daily ingested calories very accurately and very profoundly. And that, by the way, that less than half a potato chip, as I show here, okay, corresponds to an amount of nutrients that is undetectable by any voluntary means of detecting them. By the way, 4 to 5 calories a day is also undetectable if you're trying to calibrate the amount of energy you expend in any given day. So when the day is done, I would argue that daily energy balance, not merely energy expenditure, but energy balance, is an evolved physiological trait, independent of culture, independent of behavioral differences, even independent of food intake, so that if you eat more by a couple hundred calories, your body has a mechanism to dispose of those calories because it's normally expected to dispose of 2/3 to 3/4 of the daily ingested calories. So when we think about that, we have to ask the question, how does this occur? And it occurs because there are a series of feedback loops, as you would expect for all metabolic conditions and physiology. And one of those feedback loops is that the brain receives information from the metabolically active tissues, the muscle, liver, bone, also adipose tissue itself, and that gives a sense to the brain, to the 6 or 7 different regions of the brain that regulate these functions, gives information that allows them to maintain the balance. In addition, we know what our energy stores are because adipose tissue is an active endocrine organ, and it synthesizes and secretes a whole variety of adipocytokines, the most notable of which is leptin. And leptin is secreted in proportion to the amount of adipose tissue you have. So if you think of adipose tissue as the gas tank of the human body, then leptin becomes the gas gauge, and the brain knows, are we under or over saturated in the amount of energy stores that we have. And so we can regulate to that information. And then finally, we need to know what the environment looks like with respect to nutrients that will feed the system. And we know that from our senses, but even more precisely, we know the nature, the quantity, and the quality of recently ingested nutrients simply as a basis of the more than 150 different receptor subtypes, receptors for nutrients, that are present throughout the gastrointestinal tract. So when we put it all together, the body takes this information and regulates to a set point. Now I want to emphasize that the concept of a set point is often misunderstood as meaning that we have a number that sits in a balloon over our heads that says you're going to be 222 pounds and somebody else is going to be 146.3 pounds. No, like every other set point, it is the integration of our genetic predisposition, the immediate environment in which we find ourselves, and of course with a strong contribution of our life history or our developmental history, in utero history, early childhood history, and the like, and our set point for hematocrit, liver size, serum sodium level, and other kinds of metabolic parameters changes over time. and as it does, of course, for body fat. And it's really, when we talk about weight, we're really talking about body fat, because the other contributions to weight don't change nearly as easily as body fat does. Muscle, of course, can go up and down with exercise. Bones change in one direction usually over the course of a life, but body fat goes up and down. So the body maintains this set point, and if you move off of that set point in a negative direction, your body will undergo what's called metabolic adaptation. To decrease energy expenditure, you'll also get hungrier, and the combination of becoming hungrier and increasing your energy intake and decreasing your resting energy expenditure will lead you back to that set point. The same thing occurs acutely with overeating. You'll tend to burn off the extra calories, and you'll tend to be less hungry, so you'll eat less. And so you maintain yourself within that set point shown as the gray bar on this slide. Now, an example of that, and this is from a paper that was published about a year ago in the New England Journal of Medicine, a group of investigators led by Dr. Sumitran put patients on a very low-calorie diet, an 800-calorie diet, and they lost an enormous amount of weight, as you can see here, and then maintained them on a less severe diet over the course of the next year, and you can see that they started to gain weight, as is typical for any of these types of weight loss interventions. The key thing that this study added to that scenario was that they measured a whole variety of hormones that are known to regulate energy balance, food intake, and energy expenditure. And on the next slide, I'll show you that you can look at 4 of these hormones. They include ghrelin, which promotes energy storage by increasing appetite, PYY, CCK, and amylin, 3 hormones that promote energy dissipation by decreasing appetite and increasing energy expenditure. And if you note on this slide, the black is the baseline values in relationship to a meal. So the 0 time point is before the meal, and then you see the times after the meal. You'll note that in the blue, at the end of the acute weight loss phase, ghrelin levels go up significantly, indicating that there could be a drive toward increased appetite. And the PYY, CCK, and amylin levels all go down, showing that putting the brakes on satiety, or again favoring an increased appetite and weight regain. And the, I don't know, surprising, but certainly the most notable finding in this study is that even at week 62, a year after they go on a so-called maintenance program and they're still gaining weight, that these hormonal changes are in the same direction. The body has not changed its set point. What it has done is it continues to try to counteract the acute weight loss that it exhibited or that it underwent a year earlier, so that these hormones are pushing in the direction of regaining all the weight that has not been regained at the time of the end of the study. As you can see here in the previous slide, the patients had only gained portion of the lost weight. So, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, this is a classic thing. I've seen this in the various diet things and always thought it was non-compliance, that people would give it a good try with their diet and be really good, and then it kind of would fade a little bit. I guess in part the design here was a little bit less intensive, but you're saying that it's the intake but also the body's response to food that keeps driving.
Exactly, and this, what we're seeing here, is the hormonal response, because it's easy to measure hormones. We have no doubt that there are neuronal responses that push in the same direction. And when you do these kinds of studies in animals, where you can control the environment much more directly than you can in human studies, and of course the animals don't receive any instructions, they simply do what their bodies want them to do, you'll get the same results. You'll see the exact same phenotype that you see in these human patients. So as we consider then, we can think of obesity more than simply a predisposition to other diseases or a failure of willpower, but really it's a failure of this weight regulatory system. And of course there are multiple influences over any physiological phenotype. So genetics set the stage. Your developmental history essentially affects your phenotype, but then the immediate environment that you're living under is the final step in the process. Indeed, obesity is largely determined by your genetic predisposition, but the obesity epidemic, since our genes haven't changed in any significant way over the last many years, the obesity epidemic is almost entirely caused by changes in the environment, which then work on a susceptible individual. So now as we look at this a little bit more in more detail, you can ask the question, well, what are those environmental drivers to obesity? And there are probably dozens, if not more than 100 of them. I'm going to group them into 4 groups for the purposes of today's talk. And 2 of those groups you're going to consider obvious, but I'd like to present them in a slightly different way to cause you to think more about the physiology of this problem rather than the mere behavioral aspects of it. So the first is the altered food supply. Now, historically, we've thought that people who have obesity just eat too much, or certainly they eat more than they burn. But we now know, with all of these receptors that I described for nutrients, not only in the GI tract, but throughout the body, and the hormonal effects of almost everything that we eat, we know that the signaling properties of the food supply have the ability to alter the set point. And if you think about obesity as not weight gain, the weight gain state is an interesting state, but the weight gain state could exist whether you're thin or whether you have obesity. But the obesity state is fundamentally different. And so the obesity state is the maintenance of body fat at a level which is too high as a result of the set point of the body being set too high. And so food signaling properties can change the set point. And of course, if your set point suddenly goes up by 40 pounds, then there are only 2 ways to get there, which is to burn fewer calories and to eat more. So I would argue that the changes in food intake are the result of changes in physiology that come from the changes in the food supply. It does not take the food supply off the hook. In fact, the changes in the food supply are one of the primary reasons, if not the primary driver, environmental driver to obesity. Now, the second major driver to obesity is decreased physical activity, not because of the failure to burn calories. As I showed you in one of the earlier slides, the Hodges burn 1,000 more calories per day by running around, but the body compensates because the body knows that it wants to burn a certain number of calories, and if you burn more by running around, you'll burn fewer at rest. But decreased physical activity has a second detrimental effect, which is it makes the muscles less functional. And it turns out, through studies that also published in 2012, that the muscles make a variety of circulating factors, myokines, that regulate this whole process. So if you have sick muscle because you don't exercise at all, those muscles will not tend to promote a good set point or energy balance. And indeed, exercising has been shown to signal to brown fat, to activate brown fat, and to increase energy expenditure. I'll come back to the value of exercise from a physiological rather than a calorie perspective in a few minutes. Third, what we often forget about is we live in a society and an environment that's fundamentally different from hundreds or thousands of years ago. Indeed, we live in a 24-hour society which disrupts circadian rhythms and disrupts sleep patterns. We live in a highly stressed society, not merely because of economic stress or interpersonal stress, but also because of the stress of the speed of life. Our brains were designed in a way that we can certainly accommodate a 10,000-fold increase in the number of communications that we get through our smartphones and the like, and a 10,000-fold increase in the speed, rather, and a 100-fold increase in the quantity. But that doesn't mean that stress isn't having some effect on our brain. And then finally, the fourth category of environmental drivers are drugs, accounting for somewhere between 5 and 10% of obesity, at least in the United States. The drugs that we use to treat the complications of obesity in many cases cause more obesity, which is an unfortunate vicious cycle that we get ourselves into. Looking at it this way, each of these environmental drivers is affecting the physiology, increasing the set point, and merely our behavior is merely a response to that increase in set point. We have to find a way to get there. And as with therapy for obesity, if it's a fight between your body's physiology and your willpower, in almost every case your willpower will lose. We can come back to that a little later in the questions. Now, when we think about macro-environmental influences, we have to think about those that we can fix and those that we can't fix. And there are a number of these macro-environmental influences that as individual physicians, as individual providers, as patients, we can't fix. We need to work on those from a public health and policy perspective. But there are also a variety of micro-environmental influences that we can influence, and those include the types of nutrients that we choose to eat, the schedules by which we eat, which influences circadian rhythms, physical activity that we choose to do to make our muscles healthy, how our sleep health, the the drugs and medications we use or prescribe, and local stressors, even if we can't control global stressors.
Yeah, this is, I have to say, absolutely fascinating to see, the concept that the exercise is not the number of calories that the elliptical machine says I'm burning by calculating my weight and how fast I'm going or how slowly, but that it changes all these hormones in the set point. It's just eye-opening to me.
Absolutely, and I think when you consider that many of the papers that have been published that provide the greatest support for these notions are all within the last 3 years, and the actual identification of some of these myokines. And of course, for a cardiology audience, we have to consider that the first myokine that was discovered was a cardiac myokine, which is a natriuretic peptide, or 2 myokines, because initially those were thought to be only protective of the heart. And we now know that they have enormous influences outside of the heart, meaning that they do circulate and they have targets elsewhere than the heart. And so that means that they have the functions of a cardiac myokine. Now, in terms of the natriuretic peptides, if you knock them out, you end up in a mouse, you end up with an obese diabetic mouse. So they are myokines that actually influence obesity and diabetes function. And so like the newer myokines that were discovered this year, that come out of skeletal muscle, there's going to be a whole universe of activities, physiological activities emanating from muscle.
I mean, I could see, very much that you could talk to patients about it's not just how much you do, like the 20 minutes, 30 minutes, but you have to move, and I guess one of the things is choose to move as a program, and that might be changing the physiology. I guess there is, Robert Lehrman is asking, are there citations or stuff on these myokines that you could point people to?
Sure, and I think that I can't cite off the top of my head the citation on the natriuretic peptides and their hormonal function, but there's a paper in Nature from January or February of 2012 that talks about this new myokine, irisin, I-R-I-S-E-N. That is the first well-described skeletal myokine. In that paper, there are 4 other candidate myokines described, and I know that over the next year or two, we're going to be seeing those coming forward as having been proven to be myokines as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. Now, you pointed out on the macro level, we could maybe go back a slide, potentially the speed of life. I hear this from my wife that I need to slow it down a little bit, and some of these you could modify a little bit, I think, in trying to take time out, or like shutting, the cell phone free day and something like that, which I did because I couldn't find my iPhone 5 charger and there were none to be had. So I was like, oh, no cell phone for 2 days. But those kind of silly things seem to feed into this a little bit, that it could slow down the body and change physiology, I suppose, that could help.
And I think that I put that down as a local stressor. What you can control, this is a stressor that you can control to some degree. Unfortunately, when you go log back online, you may find
all those emails are still sitting right there.
Emails still waiting for you. And I think that that's one example. But we live in the most economically efficient society. Americans have the lowest amount of vacation time of any society in the world now. The notion that these kinds of global changes in our lifestyle don't have an effect, I think, is silly. And I think that what we now recognize is there are a whole variety of diseases that are diseases of modern society. We think of them as including the autoimmune diseases, the asthmas and the inflammatory bowel diseases, but these metabolic diseases may fall in the same category. And indeed, there's a lot of overlap between the regulation of inflammation and the regulation of metabolism.
It's really, this is just absolutely fascinating.
So of course, when the day is done, we can talk about the biology, but we really need to say, how are we going to use the biology to develop better treatments? And we know that treatments are not as effective as we want them to be, not even close. The patients are frustrated. We get frustrated as providers. The world is frustrated. And I think that leads to some of the continuation of the misunderstanding of why it is that people don't lose weight when they have obesity in the first place. And we tend to blame it on the patients themselves, and it's easy to do because the patients accept that blame because society will allow us to accept that or to give that blame away. So when we talk about treatment, I want to talk about treatment in 3 parts. I want to talk about lifestyle modification, and I want to argue that the goal of lifestyle modification is to reverse or at least have an impact on the environmental influences that cause obesity in the first place. Second, I'll talk a little bit about surgery, which is used only in 1 in 400 patients with obesity per year in the United States, but it provides important clues as to how we might do something better for the other 399. And then third, I want to talk about pharmacotherapy. And pharmacotherapy we don't have too much to talk about, but at least I'll give you what we do know. So with respect to lifestyle therapy, as I mentioned, we want to normalize the microenvironment. And we want to do that the best we can with the tools we have. And unfortunately, the tools we have are limited. Now, there are a whole variety of different kinds of popular diets, from the Atkins, low carbohydrate diet all the way to the Ornish, very low fat diet. And you can see in this slide that the distributions of protein in green, fat in yellow, and carbohydrate in orange varies quite dramatically from diet to diet. But in a study, an important study published 3 years ago by Frank Sachs at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, what he and his colleagues found, looking at 4 such diets, is that there was no difference in 2-year outcome, regardless of which diet was used. Now, I want to emphasize that, and something that we're not going to spend a lot of time on today, is that obesity is not a single disease. Obesity may be as many as 100 different diseases with different physiological or pathophysiological underpinnings. So within each of these groups, in Dr. Sachs' studies and other studies that have been done, there may be a few people who respond. We all know people who respond to a particular diet. But on average, no diet was better than any other diet. Now, on average, the Atkins type of low-carbohydrate diet reliably causes more weight loss at 6 months and reliably causes more weight gain in the second 6 months, so that at the end of a year or more, there's no difference. I think it's important to note. So it would make you think, well, it doesn't matter which diet, but does diet matter? Well, in the look-ahead trial, we found that the amount of weight loss correlated very nicely with the amount of physical activity that the subjects were participating in. And you can see here in the 4 quartiles, the more exercise that they did, the more physical activity that they incorporated into their daily lifestyle, the more weight that they lost. Now, that doesn't mean, and the numbers don't add up to mean, that it's because of the increased number of calories they burned while exercising. In fact, I would interpret these data as strong support of the notion that chronically, that exercise changes physiology. And indeed, there are more than 100 studies in the literature that show that exercise does not cause acute weight loss, but does prevent weight regain. And I can think of no better example of the sort of discordance in data that would argue against counting calories, because after all, what would it matter if you burn the calories in January when you're trying to lose weight, or in April when you're preventing weight regain? But it does matter because it's the chronic exercise, it's not the calories burned during acute exercise that matter to the system. Now, when we look at the effects of chronic exercise, I hinted at a few of them a few minutes ago, but in both animal studies and in human studies, chronic exercise has been shown to decrease food intake. It alters food preferences toward healthier foods. It increases the development of brown fat, and brown fat burns energy. It's the white fat. We only have about 100 grams of brown fat or less in our bodies. That's an oven for us. It keeps us warm. White fat stores energy. I mentioned irisin. It enhances energy. Chronic exercise enhances resting energy expenditure and lowers the energy set point. Again, doing all the things that are the opposite of what causes obesity in the first place.
I have to say that, this is just absolutely fascinating and rings true for me. Thinking about the last year, I had gotten on a pretty good exercise kick trying to keep up with my daughter who's doing cross-country skiing. That's like, all those people are in such good shape. So I'd be running around.
Hadza, I think.
Yeah, but I found that, I forget exactly what all I was eating, but I was in like really good shape for a long period of time. And then it's been a little slacker lately, and suddenly it's not so great. And there seemed to be a much longer tail on the benefit in terms of my weight versus the exercise that I had done chronically. I guess for like a 6-month period, I was exercising a lot.
So if you think about it in terms of quality of muscle function, or quality of muscle leading to better function, you'd expect that. Yeah. You'd expect that there would be a tail. Most people who are in need of acute weight loss don't do the study on themselves that you're describing on yourself. But one of the expectations of this is that, let's say you get laid up for a period of time, that there should be a tail if you were a previously active individual. Now, at some point, of course, you're going to become deconditioned, and we know that can happen in the hospital very quickly. But nonetheless, I think that the point you're making when describing your own history is exactly on target.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Now, as we move away from or beyond lifestyle therapies, I want to focus for a few minutes on surgical therapies. Surgical therapies are profoundly effective, and the question really is why. And so let's just talk about that. There are three basic types of surgery that are most commonly done around the world. One is the adjustable gastric band, in which an inflatable band is placed around the proximal stomach, slowing the passage of food from the esophagus through the proximal stomach into the distal stomach. We think that it works primarily by stimulating pressure receptors or tension receptors in the proximal stomach, but that's still not completely proven or known. The second operation is a vertical sleeve gastrectomy, also a uniquely gastric operation, where the greater curvature of the stomach, shown by the arrow here, is simply resected. The food flows through a normal pathway, but it turns out that with a sleeve gastrectomy, the food more rapidly flows through the stomach and is dumped, if you will, or rapidly transits to the duodenum. And the most common and the third operation is Roux-Y gastric bypass. And in a Roux-Y gastric bypass, you isolate the proximal stomach, as shown where the arrow is, the top arrow is here, and the food flows from the esophagus into this small pouch. But then that pouch is emptied directly into the mid-jejunum, such that the alimentary flow bypasses the distal stomach, the duodenum, and proximal jejunum. Now, you should also note that where the food is flowing, where that top arrow is, there's no bile and there's no pancreatic secretions. The bile and the pancreatic secretions are in the other limb, which doesn't see any food. I mention that because these issues may have a role to play in exactly how these operations work. So on the left, you have two uniquely gastric operations, and then you have the combination procedure, which includes a diversionary component in order to allow the stomach pouch to be emptied. You're bypassing the duodenum. So as we think about that then, and how these operations may work, we should also look at their efficacy. Now, people often talk about the fact that initial weight loss is particularly good, but then there's a lot of weight regain. So I'd like to focus here in comparing the weight loss with lifestyle modification in the green curve here from the diabetes prevention program, with gastric banding and gastric bypass shown in the orange and blue curves respectively from the Swedish obesity subjects study. And we can look at the acute changes over the first year, but I think it's more illustrative to look at 10 years later. And if you look 10 years later in the last point on this curve, you'll see that in the DPP there was an average 2% weight loss at 10 years. With gastric banding it's an average 13%, and with gastric bypass an average 28%. And so the real question is why those dramatic differences. Yes, there is some weight regain. You can see it in the shape of the curves. But the weight regain isn't the real story here. The real story here is the distance between these curves. So when we think about why bariatric surgery is so effective, we have to hearken back to the way bariatric surgery was developed and how we thought about it many years ago. And we thought it was mechanical, that you physically restricted the amount of food you could eat at any given time by a small pouch. And perhaps with this diversionary component, you caused malabsorption. We now know, and I don't have time to go into all the details, is that it's almost entirely physiological. What these operations do is they change the flow of nutrients in a way that changes the signaling that comes out of the gut and goes to the rest of the body. So that neuroendocrine signaling from the gut to the brain, from the gut to the pancreas and liver, somehow or other collaborate to change physiology in a way that not only causes change in energy balance and a decrease in set point, but also causes a change in metabolic function, which is one of the ways these operations improve diabetes. So when we think about it from the perspective of the GI tract, if the GI tract at its base, with all those 150 or more receptors, is the way the body responds physiologically to ingested nutrients, through neuroendocrine mechanisms as shown here, it signals to the rest of the body and regulates body weight and metabolic function as shown on the right. When we do a gastric bypass or other effective metabolic procedures, you're basically changing the signaling as shown here. And so with a gastric bypass, you're changing the signaling from the gut to the brain to the liver and the pancreas, leading to weight loss and improvement in glucose homeostasis and diabetes. Now, another way to look at it, coming back to the set point slide that I showed earlier, before surgery, this individual patient is being shown in these idealized curves to have a set point of body fat storage set point that correlates with a body mass index of 40. What surgery does is it changes these physiologically determined curves so that the metabolic adaptation and the drive to energy intake, appetitive drive, change after the operation. So the increased energy intake, the increased appetitive drive after surgery is blunted. You see it still goes up as you lose body fat, but it doesn't go up as much. And the metabolic adaptation, the drive to conservation of energy expenditure, is also blunted. And so now when the patient wakes up from the surgery, they wake up with a new set point. And actually, as they wake up, they're in the overfed state, as shown in this slide here, is that they basically are no longer at equilibrium, and they drive themselves to a new and lower energy storage set point.
You showed the physiology is fascinating, and I think there's been talk about how the metabolic changes post-surgery are within a week. Are there differences in the two different operations? With the sleeve seemingly would have less of a change in the set point hormones and whatnot?
Well, so this is one of the great surprises and still unanswered questions. If you go back and you compare the band to a bypass, the answer to your question, if you just substitute band instead of sleeve, is yes. The band does not have those hormonal, those physiological effects that the bypass does. The real surprise is the sleeve does. And the sleeve does not include a component of a diversionary procedure. It does not bypass the duodenum. And yet, the hormones like GLP-1 that I'll show you in a minute, or other hormones that go up in response to the bypass, also go up in response to the sleeve gastrectomy. It's an unknown. The answer to that question remains unknown as the subject of a lot of research right now. So again, to summarize then, remember that earlier I showed that even with prolonged period of time after a diet, that GLP-1, PYY, and amylin went down. After gastric bypass, they all go up. That's the top curve in each one of these figures here. Ghrelin, which goes up and stays up after diet-induced weight loss, goes down and actually stays down after surgery. So what this shows is that surgery essentially has physiological effects that are the exact opposite of diet. The diet causes a counter-regulatory response that pushes you back to your original set point. And surgery changes the set point, and the body responds by driving itself through these hormones and other mechanisms down to the new set point. And it stays there. And so, or generally stays there. So we would summarize then, how does surgery work? Not by mechanically restricting food intake, not by inducing calorie malabsorption, but rather by changing physiology to adjust the energy balance equation. And indeed, it changes the set point for energy or fat storage, since 98% of our energy is stored in the form of fat. And that allows us then to consider maybe surgery as a model for how we might develop better therapies that are non-surgical. Remember, surgery is only used in 0.25% of people with obesity. So the implications for obesity and diabetes of this knowledge is that since greater than 90% of the effects of surgery are physiological, it gives us enormous opportunity, because if surgery worked mechanically, all we could do is, maybe we could use an endoscope, but we'd basically have to reproduce the surgery itself. But because it works physiologically, we perhaps and expectedly will be able to ultimately bypass the surgery or the physical manipulation and go straight at the physiology that surgery induces, using endoscopic approaches, devices, drugs, even changes in nutrition and nutraceutical agents. And I think when we think about changing diet, right now we're doing it empirically. But if we understood the nature of the signaling and the changes in signaling that different types of nutrients could cause in the presence of surgery, in the absence of surgery, et cetera, we would be able to, in a more organized way, in a more proactive way, design diets that not only were appropriate for patients with obesity, but were appropriate for different types of obesity. We're nowhere near there yet. So in the last part of the talk, I really want to focus on pharmacological therapies, because pharmacological therapies are the therapies that we can add to our armamentarium. There are some new ones that are just out now. And in the ideal world, these would have been developed to reproduce the profound effects of surgery. Of course, those profound effects really have been only understood more recently. But let's talk about medications. I think the most important thing we can do from a pharmacological perspective is to try to remove the drugs that are causing more weight gain, the fourth environmental influence that I talked about earlier. So the slide says the strategy should be to aim for double benefits. For those people who are used to treating diabetes on the bottom of the slide, if we can use fewer sulfonylureas and less insulin, and use, particularly in patients with obesity and type 2 diabetes, and use more of the newer agents within the ability to tolerate their side effects and the costs. But to the degree that we can do that, we probably will have a greater pharmacological effect on obesity than almost anything else we can do. We can also do that in the other major category of diseases whose drugs cause profound weight gain, and that's the psychiatric diseases. And so some of those are shown here, using bupropion, topiramate, zonisamide, instead of using some of the other weight gain promoting drugs. But with respect to treating obesity itself and proactively, I think we have four basic drugs. We have phentermine, which was approved in 1959. That's an adrenergic drug. It turns out to be quite effective, although not used very much, and very inexpensive. We have the new drug Qsymia, which is a combination of phentermine and topiramate, one of the drugs I showed in the previous slide. That drug has recently been released and has been on the market for about 2 months. We have a drug, lorcaserin, which has been approved by the FDA this year and will be on the market in February or March of 2013. And we have a drug approved in 1998, orlistat, which is a drug that inhibits pancreatic and intestinal lipase and works in theory, although it's not terribly effective, works in theory by preventing absorption of ingested fats and fatty acids. I want to emphasize that the first three drugs actually appear to influence the energy balance set point. Unfortunately, orlistat is a little bit like the way we used to think about surgery. By blocking absorption, you're not really changing physiology, unfortunately, too much, probably, and that's probably why orlistat is as weak as it is.
With the first three, you said they work on the set point. A question came in of how does the set point get set in the first place, and how does it get so far out of balance that?
So we don't know how it gets so far out of balance, except that we hypothesize that in genetically susceptible people, that the environment is what's doing that. All those environmental influences that I was talking about create a perfect storm. And none of the environmental influences create thinness. All of the ones that I described, modern environment drives us toward an obesogenic state, just as the hygiene hypothesis would argue that the modern environment drives us toward an autoimmune inflammatory state. And I think that those are fundamental changes in modern society, and obesity really started, it wasn't detectable, but it really started with the Industrial Revolution. And the fundamental changes in our environment started with the Industrial Revolution and have been accelerating ever since.
Interesting. I can say that we'll have questions now towards the end. We're reaching then, and feel free to send in questions. We'd be happy to pose them.
We can stop anytime. So
yeah, no,
but
thank
you. So one of the things that is little discussed about drugs, though, and this is a drug that was taken off the market, but even before it was taken off the market, it was little used. That's sibutramine or Meridia. And if you look at weight loss, not as the average weight loss, which was about 6.5%, you look at the distribution of weight loss as shown on this slide. I think one of the things is that even for sibutramine with an only 6.5% weight loss, you see that there is a subset of people that I like to call the responder tail. Maybe we can make the responder tail a little bit bigger here. A subset of people that exhibited profound weight loss. And for that subgroup of people, and again, it comes back to thinking about obesity as multiple diseases rather than one. For that subgroup, here we have a very profound, perhaps permanent solution to their problem. But the vast majority outside the box on this slide, of course, those people need to have a different therapy. And if we move back from drugs to lifestyle modification, we see the same situation. Some people will have a dramatic response to a change in their diet or a change in their exercise program or better sleep or what have you, but most people won't. And I think every therapy that we come up with, including surgery, by the way, every therapy we come up with has this kind of a distribution. And I think we're going to have to find ways, either by identifying predictors or just empiric experience, find ways to match the right therapy to the right patient. When we approach obesity as 100 different diseases, I think we have a much better chance of actually finding the right therapy for the right patient and in the aggregate ending up with a better outcome for all patients. So as we think about a pharmacological strategy, we want to optimize the patient's current medical regimen, as I mentioned. We want to pursue sequential trials of different medications. We can use a lot of medications off-label because we're comfortable with them, but in the non-specialist environment, I think we might want to limit ourselves to the drugs that are formally approved and combinations of those drugs. So we want to aim for clinically significant weight loss, not a little bit of weight loss in everybody, but find the patients who get the dramatic benefit and ignore, at least from the purposes of that drug, the patients who don't. And we want to use them always in conjunction with lifestyle-based therapy. And remember, different lifestyles, different components of lifestyle will work to a different degree for different patients. So this is an example of an algorithm that I'm not going to walk you through, but I just want to show you on the left all the different medications we use on-label and off-label. And we use them sequentially and in combination. On the left is what we do. We move down that list as if there's inadequate weight loss from any medication, we start adding things. If a particular medication shows some weight loss, but we want to enhance that weight loss, we'll add topiramate, phentermine, or another second agent. But we can focus more directly on the drugs that are currently approved, and these are the ones I'd recommend that people listening today might want to think about. Phentermine is still a good drug. You just have to learn how to use it safely. It causes tachycardia in some patients. It causes hypertension in some patients. But in the main, if used carefully, and we require every patient to have a home blood pressure and pulse monitor and show us that they know how to use it effectively. But we find that it's particularly effective and very inexpensive. We can add topiramate by just switching from phentermine to Qsymia. We soon will be able, if those drugs don't work, go to lorcaserin. We have a dotted line to orlistat, although it's not a drug that I'm terribly fond of. And then, of course, we can add back drugs so that we can add back phentermine to lorcaserin as a theoretical possibility, although since lorcaserin has not been released yet, that we'll have to see how that plays out. But at least this more simplified algorithm begins to give you a guide as to how you'd use the drugs in sequence rather than saying, do I use this drug or that drug and expect it to work in everybody. So where we are today, in summary, is that unfortunately we have very limited treatment options for obesity. We have the operations on the right that are very effective for individual patients, but they're invasive and they're only used in a very small number of patients, so they're not a public health solution to this public health problem. On the left, we have diet and exercise, which is, and other forms of lifestyle modification, which currently is this gold standard for public health intervention, but for the individual patient, rarely is effective. We have a few medications that maybe are slightly up the scale, but we really need some things in the middle. And there are a whole variety of newer approaches, newer medications, including things like liraglutide being used for weight loss, intraluminal devices, and the like. But I think the real benefit will come when we start combining things. We have a complex network, physiological network, that's regulating this whole energy balance business. And that network, if you want to fix it when it's gone awry, is probably not going to be responsive to hitting a single node because there are too many counter-regulatory possibilities. So if you hit with multiple interventions, you have the greatest possibility of the greatest effect, and we could conclude, therefore, that surgery, because it's somewhat of a blunt instrument, although effective, is hitting lots of nodes in this regulatory network, and that's why surgery is so effective. So where we are then with combination therapies, we hope that we'll be able to improve effectiveness without increasing or perhaps even decreasing overall invasiveness of the therapy. So in summary, overall then, the goals of patient evaluation and therapy for obesity are, first, identify and treat the comorbidities. We can be 100% successful doing that. We can reduce disparities that I didn't have time to talk about that are experienced by patients with obesity, medical disparities. We can be 100% successful with that. And then we can start the process on the basis of all of our success in the first two bullet points to develop a long-term strategy. We can be more successful, but not fully successful for sure at this point. For obesity therapy itself, lifestyle change is still the mainstay of therapy. Surgery, because it works so well and it works so physiologically, can provide us with a guide, but still is used in a very small percentage of patients. Medications can be effective, but you have to use them in a slightly different way from the way we used them before. And that's where I'll stop.
This is terrific, and we have a flurry of questions that have come in. Talking a lot about the different drugs, I think one simple question on beginning with exercise, if someone came in first visit, what kind of exercise program do you suggest? Something to get the whatever they are again, the hormones?
Myokines, yes.
Myokines,
So we need to do a whole new series of studies, because all exercise studies to date have focused on the cardiac benefit, the strength benefit, the amount of calories burned benefit at the time of exercise. What we now know is that maybe the most important aspect of exercise for obesity is these myokines, is the health of the muscle itself. Is it going to be resistance exercise or aerobic exercise? Is it going to be different muscle groups? You know, different fat depots have dramatically different physiological effects. I suspect different muscle depots will. So we're going to have to start the process of studying exercise in this new way, cognizant of these hormonal effects of muscle. But for the moment, I think the balanced approach is the way to go. You obviously want to have aerobic exercise for all of the benefits that it provides. You want to have strength exercise, resistance exercise for the benefits that it provides.
And a couple people wrote in that, you know, each diet and even bariatric surgery had a weight regain. Is it understood why, or are there things someone else asked that we could do to help avoid that?
I think there are a number of things we could do to help avoid it, but we have to remember that what we're aiming to do in the treatment of obesity is create the weight-reduced state. And the weight-reduced state is different from the obese state, and so that's why the diabetes is so much better. Even with 5% weight loss, you can see a dramatic improvement in diabetes. But there's a second physiology that we have to be cognizant of, which is the weight-losing state. And that's not the same as the weight-reduced state. You have more mechanisms in play as you're lowering your weight, and you lose those mechanisms when you stabilize at the lower weight. And so what happens is you always get a bounce. You see a more dramatic improvement in diabetes as a result of losing weight. So a 5% weight loss at the time you're losing the weight is quite dramatic in its effect on diabetes. But you know that the look-ahead study did not show as good long-term outcomes as was expected. And partially that is because when you maintain a 5% weight loss, you're no longer in the active losing phase. And so with all of these things, I think weight regain is part of this little bounce effect that we see with all this physiology.
You know, that we have so many other questions, unfortunately, that I can't all get to. Nutraceuticals, I guess you mentioned, are there any that pop up quickly that we could recommend?
I think that, you know, I'm not going to mention a nutraceutical. I'm going to mention a slightly different thing, which is probiotics. We now know that the microbiota of the gut have a very important influence on this whole physiological process. So if you think of probiotics, they're essentially nutraceuticals. They're in the context of food. We're providing a therapeutic, specific therapeutic thing. So if you extend that to drug-like effects of food, then that's what a nutraceutical is.
Well, I want to thank you. This is absolutely fascinating. I think I've learned so much about physiology, I think, of this. I thought it was all intake, outtake, and it's a whole environment ongoing. And I think, as you point out, does offer great hope for new targets, new understanding of this weight-losing state and how to maintain better. And it's just fascinating. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I wish we were further along, but I think we'll get there.
Yeah. Well, I'd also like to thank various sponsors: Abbott Vascular, Amarin, Boehringer Ingelheim, Daiichi Sankyo, Lilly USA, and St. Jude Medical for their support of this important educational series. Also want to remind all of you to complete the quiz at the end of the session to secure your CME credits. And coming up, stay tuned for ACS and PCI, a focus on the platelet. I'm Chris Cannon, and thanks very much for joining us.